The wind howled like a living thing, a maddened beast that tore through the frozen landscape, relentless and unforgiving. Snow whipped through the air, thick and suffocating, blurring everything in sight. The world had turned into a blur of white and gray, an inhospitable wilderness that seemed to mock any attempt to survive within it. Sasha's breath came out in visible clouds, the cold biting at her cheeks, her hands numb inside her gloves. She had been walking for hours, though it felt like days, each step a battle against the icy grip of the storm. Her boots crunched on the snow, each movement slower than the last as her body screamed for rest. But there was no time for rest, not with the storm growing fiercer and the sun sinking lower into the horizon. She couldn't let herself freeze. Not now. The small hiking trail she had been following had long since disappeared under the snow. The map, once a lifeline, was useless now, buried in the folds of her jacket, sodden with melted snow. It was a miracle she hadn't lost her way entirely, but even that thought did little to comfort her. She was alone. No one would come looking for her, not in a place like this, not in the middle of nowhere. As if to punctuate her thoughts, the storm hit again, a sudden gust of wind that knocked her off balance. She staggered, struggling to regain her footing, her heart hammering in her chest. The snow around her danced, forming eddies and whirlpools of white. She should have turned back hours ago. She should have known better, but there had been no turning back. The trip had been important, a chance to prove something to herself. Now she realized it might cost her everything. She barely noticed the shape at first, a dark silhouette against the snowstorm. Her tired eyes squinted, struggling to focus, until the shape became clearer. A tree, a tall, bare oak, gnarled and twisted by the years. And something else, something that shouldn't have been there. A dog. Sasha froze, blinking through the stinging snowflakes. The dog was tethered to the tree, its head hanging low, its body hunched as though it had been there for far too long. The fur was matted and dirty, its ribs visible beneath its coat. It was a German shepherd, a breed known for its strength. Yet this one looked frail, broken. Sasha's heart twisted in her chest. She had to keep moving. She couldn't afford to stop. There was a chance that a shelter, some kind of safe haven, lay just ahead. She couldn't risk it. But something in the dog's eyes stopped her in her tracks. A look of desperation, of hopelessness, that mirrored her own fear. A deep, involuntary breath left her lips as she took a cautious step forward, her feet crunching softly in the snow. The wind screamed around them, but in that moment, everything felt muted, as if the storm itself had quieted to watch. "Hey, girl," Sasha whispered, her voice shaking from the cold. The dog's ears flicked, and she froze, unsure whether it was even alive. She approached slowly, every step measured, her body trembling more from the sight of the creature than from the cold. It was almost surreal. This wasn't the kind of place one found animals, especially not ones tied to a tree in the middle of a snowstorm. The dog raised its head slowly, its eyes flickering with a dim recognition. Sasha's stomach churned. She couldn't leave it there. No one in their right mind could walk past an animal like that and not try to help. But she was freezing, exhausted, lost. The rational part of her mind screamed at her to ignore it, to keep moving, to find shelter for herself before she too was lost to the elements. But the other part of her, the part that could never look away from a creature in need, tugged at her heart, forcing her to step closer. The rope that bound the dog to the tree was crude, tied tightly with no care for comfort. Sasha knelt beside the animal, her fingers stiff from the cold, working at the knot. It wouldn't budge. Panic began to rise in her chest. The wind was howling again, and the storm felt like it was closing in, swallowing her whole. She needed to act. She couldn't waste time. With one sharp tug, she ripped the knot free, and the dog's collar fell loose. She reached out, her gloved hand brushing the dog's fur. It flinched but didn't pull away. Slowly, cautiously, it stood, its body trembling as though it hadn't moved in days. But it stood, and that was something. "Come on," Sasha muttered, helping it to its feet. She reached out to help steady it, but the dog let out a low whine, staggering on its legs. It was weak, too weak to walk far on its own, but she couldn't just leave it. She couldn't. Sasha's resolve hardened, the fear in her chest giving way to something else. She wasn't sure what yet, but it was there. The storm hadn't eased. The horizon was a blur, and Sasha was on the edge of collapse herself. But she couldn't leave the dog to die in the snow. Together, they stumbled forward, step by painful step, each struggling in their own way against the wind and snow. Sasha had no idea what lay ahead, no idea how far she'd have to go. But she had to keep moving. She had to keep going. They needed each other now. The storm seemed to intensify with every passing minute, the wind shrieking like a mad animal, as if it had taken on a life of its own. Sasha could barely make out her own hand in front of her face, the wide-out conditions pressing against her, forcing her to squint through the howling blizzard. The dog staggered beside her, struggling to keep up, but it wasn't giving up. Its breath came in shallow bursts, its feet dragging through the snow, but there was a spark of determination in its eyes that kept her moving. She didn't know how much longer they could go on like this. The fatigue was overwhelming. She was drenched in sweat from exertion, but the cold was still gnawing at her bones, creeping through the layers of her clothes. Her legs burned with each step, and her thoughts were becoming disjointed. She needed to find shelter. Now, a flicker of movement caught her eye, something dark against the endless white, a shadow that stood out against the storm. For a moment, she thought it might have been a mirage. But as they drew closer, it became clearer. A structure. The vague shape of a building, half buried in snow, its roof slumped under the weight of the storm. A hut. Sasha's heart skipped a beat. It was no mansion, but it was shelter. It had to be. She urged the dog forward, gritting her teeth against the pain in her limbs. She couldn't afford to hesitate now. Every step felt like a victory against the relentless cold. She reached the hut in a few short minutes that felt like hours, the snow crunching beneath her boots with a dull sound that was swallowed by the wind. She paused before the door, checking for any sign of life, any movement. There was none. The hut was dark, and the air around it was eerily still, as though it had been abandoned for years. Sasha's hand reached for the door. It was half open, the wood weathered and old, but it didn't resist. She pushed it cautiously, stepping into the shelter with the dog following closely behind her. The air inside was musty, stale, but at least it wasn't freezing. A faint smell of rotting wood lingered, but that didn't matter. They had made it inside. That was all that mattered now. She closed the door behind her, blocking out the storm for the first time in hours. The wind seemed to howl louder outside, but at least the walls protected her from the worst of it. She collapsed onto the cold stone floor, exhausted, her body heavy with fatigue. The dog lay down beside her, its breathing still labored, but it didn't whine anymore. It was alive, and that was enough. Sasha looked around the hut, taking in her surroundings. The interior was sparse. A fireplace, though cold and empty, sat against one wall. The remnants of an old, tattered rug lay in a corner. Nothing seemed to be in use, no signs of anyone having been there in a long time. The hut felt abandoned, forgotten by time itself. A strange feeling began to settle over her, a sense of unease. There was something off about this place. Something about it didn't sit right with her. It wasn't just the isolation or the overwhelming silence. It was the way the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should be, how the darkness felt almost alive. And then, from the far corner of the room, she heard it. A sound soft at first, like a low, rasping breath. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Was she imagining it? No, she wasn't. It was real. The sound came again, slightly louder this time, a faint shuffle. Presence. Sasha's breath caught in her throat. The dog stirred beside her, its ears perked up. She looked around, scanning the dim room for any sign of movement. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking. She regretted it immediately, but it was too late. The silence stretched, oppressive, thick with tension. And then, in the shadowed corner, something moved. A figure emerged slowly, its features hidden by the dim light, but Sasha could make out the rough silhouette of a man. His clothes were torn, weathered by the storm and time, and his face was gaunt, almost skeletal. His eyes were dark, deep-set and unblinking, but there was something in them that she couldn't quite read. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The man simply stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. Sasha's pulse quickened, and she instinctively reached for the knife at her belt, though she didn't draw it. Not yet. What are you doing here? Sasha asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. This place, this hut, it's abandoned. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his boots making a faint sound against the wooden floor. His gaze flicked toward the dog, then back to her, and he gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. You shouldn't be here, the man said at last, his voice gravelly, like it hadn't been used in years. No one should be here. Sasha frowned, her throat tightening. Why? What's going on here? The man's lips curled into a strange half-smile, but there was no warmth in it. You've wandered into something far worse than the storm, he said. It's too late now. You've seen too much. Sasha's heart raced. The atmosphere in the hut felt suffocating, oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to what was coming. The man was hiding something. He knew more than he was saying, and it terrified her. Before she could ask anything more, the man turned, his movements fluid and eerie, and stepped into the deeper shadows of the room. It's not safe here, he said, his voice a low murmur. But you won't leave until it's too late. The door to the hut creaked open again, and a blast of cold air rushed inside. The storm had not let up. It never did. Sasha stood, heart pounding, her mind racing. The man was gone, disappeared into the shadows. But she knew in that moment, that nothing in this place was what it seemed. Nothing at all. Sasha stood frozen, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The door to the hut creaked under the weight of the storm's fury, but inside, there was only a suffocating silence. The man was gone, just like that, vanished into the shadows, as if he had never been there. His warning echoed in her mind, his cryptic words clawing at her thoughts. You shouldn't be here. No one should be here. You've seen too much. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she fought the creeping panic rising in her throat. The dog, still lying beside her, let out a soft whine, its eyes wide and fearful. Sasha reached down to pet it, trying to steady her own racing pulse. What did he mean by that? What had she stumbled into? And why was she starting to feel like the storm outside wasn't the only danger she faced? The shadows in the hut seemed to grow deeper, more menacing, as the wind howled around them. Sasha moved cautiously toward the fireplace, the dim light from the dying embers casting flickering shapes on the walls. Her boots scraped across the cold stone floor, each movement loud in the oppressive quiet. Her breath was shallow, a cloud of frost escaping her lips as she exhaled. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the situation. She had been walking through the storm for hours. No, it felt like days, and the thought of leaving the shelter now with the dog seemed impossible. But could she really trust this place? The strange man had appeared out of nowhere, speaking in riddles, offering no answers. The dog suddenly whined again, sitting up and looking toward the corner where the man had disappeared. Sasha followed its gaze, her body tense, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The air felt colder now. The temperature inside the hut had dropped significantly, and the shadows seemed to shift in ways they shouldn't have. She grabbed the edge of the fireplace, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. There was something there, something odd. It wasn't just the deep darkness in the corner that made her uneasy. Something about the way the room was arranged. She knelt down and brushed her hand across the floor, her fingers grazing something hidden beneath the layers of dust. A floorboard. It was slightly raised, just enough to be noticeable if you were looking for it. Sasha's heart skipped a beat. She pulled at it, her fingers slipping against the cold wood, until the board finally creaked and shifted out of place. Underneath, there was a small compartment, a hidden space, almost like a trapdoor. With a gasp, she lifted the compartment open, revealing what lay inside. A tattered piece of cloth, covered in old stains. Beneath it, an old, rusted metal box. She hesitated, her breath shallow, unsure if she should even touch it. But the pull of curiosity and fear was too strong. She reached down, her fingers brushing against the cold metal, and she carefully lifted the box from the compartment. The box was heavy, surprisingly so, and when she opened it, the stench of decay hit her like a wave. The contents were bizarre, strange and unsettling. Inside, there was a set of old photographs, their edges frayed, their faces worn and faded by time. Some were of people, others were of landscapes that were unfamiliar to her. But it wasn't the photographs that made her stomach turn. It was what was beneath them, a human skull. Old, yellowed, and cracked, it was lodged between the photos, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Her breath caught in her throat, and she slammed the box shut, a jolt of terror shooting through her veins. She couldn't explain it, but in that moment, she knew something was terribly wrong. This was no ordinary shelter. No, this was a place steeped in something darker than the storm outside. The wind howled louder, rattling the walls of the hut, and the dog let out a low growl, its fur bristling. It was the same growl it had made earlier, when the man had first appeared. Sasha's head snapped toward the corner where the man had vanished. Her eyes strained in the dark, but there was nothing, no sign of him, and yet, the oppressive sense of being watched settled heavily over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still here, lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. What had he meant when he said it was too late? Too late for what? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden creak of the door, pushed open by the wind. The cold rushed in again, colder than ever, biting through her clothes and filling the room with a gust of icy air. Sasha's heart pounded in her chest, and she turned toward the door, instinctively reaching for the knife at her belt. She took a cautious step forward, eyes scanning the room, half expecting the man to reappear, or worse, something else. The shadows danced on the walls, flickering like ghosts. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, she saw something moving in the doorway. A shadow, tall and thin, like a silhouette of a person. She froze, the air thick with dread. The figure stepped fully into the hut, and Sasha's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the man. It was something else. It was a woman, though her face was obscured by the hood of her heavy cloak. Her clothes were dark, tattered, and she moved with an unnatural grace, as though the storm itself had bent to her will. She was tall, her presence commanding, and her eyes, when they met Sasha's, were black, empty, hollow. The woman didn't speak, but she raised one hand, gesturing toward the fire. It was then that Sasha noticed the markings on the woman's hands. Strange symbols, ancient-looking, almost ritualistic. Sasha took an involuntary step back, her pulse quickening. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, her voice a soft, chilling whisper. "This place is cursed. And now you are too." The words hit Sasha like a punch to the gut. She wanted to run, to escape, but the woman's gaze held her captive, as if the very air around her was thick with magic, or something darker. Sasha's mind raced. What was going on? What was this place? And why had the man warned her? Was it too late for her to leave? Or had she already sealed her fate? The wind outside howled like a wounded beast, its voice rising and falling in a maddening crescendo. The hut, though offering some shelter, felt as though it were at the mercy of the storm, creaking and groaning under its assault. The figure of the woman stood like an immovable statue in the doorway, her dark presence dominating the room. Sasha's breath caught in her throat as the woman's black eyes fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. "You shouldn't be here," the woman repeated, her voice low, like the whisper of leaves rustling in the dead of night. There was no warmth in her tone, no sympathy, only cold certainty. Sasha's heart pounded in her chest, and her legs felt weak beneath her. The dog whined softly beside her, sensing the danger that hung in the air. She wanted to back away, to run, but something in the woman's gaze kept her rooted to the spot. "What do you mean?" Sasha finally managed to ask, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What is this place? Who are you?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped farther into the room, her movements smooth and deliberate, like someone who had spent years, perhaps lifetimes, moving through spaces just like this. Her cloak trailed behind her like a shadow, blending with the darkness that seemed to gather around her. Sasha's eyes flicked nervously toward the door. She could feel the storm's grip tightening, the cold creeping in once more. But the idea of stepping back into that blizzard was worse than the woman who stood before her. Whatever had brought her here, whatever dark energy seemed to pulse within this place, it was not something Sasha could ignore. "You shouldn't be here," the woman repeated, this time with an edge to her voice that made the hairs on the back of Sasha's neck stand up. "This place has memories, things that have been buried for too long. And now," the woman's eyes narrowed, "now you're part of them." Sasha's breath hitched in her throat. She looked around the room again, the shadows now feeling more oppressive, as though they were closing in on her. She had to understand. She couldn't just let the fear take over, not when she needed answers. "What happened here?" she pressed, her voice gaining a bit of strength despite the overwhelming sense of dread. "What are you talking about?" The woman's lips curled into something like a smile, though it was more sinister than reassuring. "This place, this shelter, it was meant to be a refuge, a sanctuary, yes, but it has become something else." She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Sasha's. "A place where those who are lost find more than just shelter. They find their fate." Sasha's blood ran cold as she looked at the woman. There was something ancient about her, something beyond the harshness of this storm, beyond the simple chill in the air. The woman spoke with the weight of someone who had witnessed things too terrible to describe, things too dark to even name. The dog's growl broke the silence, low and threatening. Sasha turned toward it, but before she could react, the woman's hand shot out, her fingers wrapping around the dog's collar in an instant. It was as if the dog had been pulled into her presence by some unseen force, its body stiffening under the woman's grasp. "No!" Sasha screamed, rushing forward, but the woman held the dog back effortlessly. The animal struggled, but its strength seemed nothing compared to the woman's unnatural power. "You should have left," the woman murmured, her voice almost a chant. "You didn't listen. You never do." Sasha lunged, pulling the dog from the woman's grasp, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what kind of force was at play here, but the cold terror that had gripped her since the moment she'd found the dog in the storm was now threatening to swallow her whole. The woman stepped back, her dark eyes flashing with something almost like satisfaction. "You're too late. It's already begun." Sasha stood frozen, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as she glanced between the woman and the dog, now panting heavily by her side. The air around them felt thick, charged. She was no longer sure what was real, what was her fear, and what was the reality of this cursed place. Suddenly, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. The shadows lengthened, twisting unnaturally, as if reaching for them. Sasha's heartbeat pounded in her ears, the storm outside no longer her only concern. She could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, the whine of the dog beside her. She could feel it, the pull, the sinking weight in her stomach. Then came the voice again. The man, distant yet closer than ever before. His voice, low and gravelly, came from the shadows. "You don't understand, do you?" Sasha's gaze flickered toward the corner, where the shadows seemed to deepen. The man's voice, familiar yet full of a menacing tone, seemed to come from the very walls. "You've crossed into something ancient," the man's voice continued, echoing in her mind. "It's too late to turn back now. The storm is just the beginning, and you've been marked. Both of you." Sasha felt a chill wash over her, and for a moment, she was sure the man's words weren't just a warning. They were a promise. The woman spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost soothing. "You can leave. But know this, nothing will ever be the same. You've seen what's here. What's been buried. Sasha's mind raced. Her legs were shaking from both fear and cold. She could leave now, run back into the storm, back into the unknown wilderness where there was still a chance she could survive. Or she could stay, uncover the truth of what had happened here. But was it worth the risk? What was the truth? And what would it cost her? Make your choice, the woman said quietly, her dark eyes gleaming with something that might have been pity or malice. Stay and face the darkness that lives here, or leave, and carry the curse with you. The cold wind outside howled louder, as if urging her to choose. But what choice was there? The room seemed to close in on Sasha, the shadows stretching longer, darker, as if alive. The woman's words echoed in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. You've been marked. The sentence replayed over and over, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It was too much to process in the midst of this storm. Her thoughts raced, her heart pounding painfully in her ears. The storm outside raged on, but it seemed distant now, like a faint memory, eclipsed by the tension inside the hut. The air was thick with something ancient and malevolent that had settled within the walls long before Sasha had stumbled into this forsaken place. Her body trembled with cold and fear, the uncertainty gnawing at her from all sides. She didn't know what to do. The dog, still close by, whimpered softly, as though sensing her turmoil. Sasha placed a hand on its head, grounding herself in the warmth of its body, trying to block out the strange presence of the woman and the man's eerie voice still echoing from the shadows. Make your choice, the woman repeated, her voice more insistent now, filled with an unsettling calm. Stay or leave, but the truth remains. And you will carry it with you, no matter what you choose. Sasha swallowed hard, the weight of her decision settling heavily in her chest. She glanced at the open door, at the howling storm outside. The idea of stepping back into that frigid wilderness, with no clear path forward, was almost as terrifying as staying. But leaving meant she would be carrying something dark, something tied to this cursed place. And no matter where she went, she would never be able to forget what she had found here. You can't escape it, the woman said softly, her dark eyes never leaving Sasha's face. Once you've seen the truth, once you've felt it, there is no running. It will follow you, as it follows everyone who enters here. Sasha clenched her fists, the cold metal of the knife in her belt digging into her side. She had been running from fear her whole life, trying to outrun the things she didn't understand, the things that haunted her thoughts. But this was different. She could feel it in the very air, thick and oppressive, like the storm itself had trapped her in a web of secrets and lies. She turned back toward the woman, who had stepped even closer now, as though the very presence of the hut and its cursed history had pulled them both into its dark gravity. The woman seemed to be waiting, watching her, as though she already knew what Sasha would choose. Tell me what happened here, Sasha demanded, her voice stronger now, the edge of desperation giving way to something else, determination. She needed to know. If she was going to face whatever this was, she had to understand it. The woman tilted her head, the faintest trace of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. You'll find out soon enough. But be warned, child. Some truths are more dangerous than the storm. And once you know them, there is no going back. Sasha's breath caught, a surge of adrenaline rushing through her veins. She felt it then, the change in the atmosphere, the electric charge that filled the room. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal, something ancient. She could almost taste it in the air. I'm not leaving, Sasha said, her voice resolute, despite the tremble in her chest. She knew there was no other choice. She couldn't run. Not from this, not from whatever this was. She had already seen too much. She had already heard the whispers in the walls, felt the weight of the past press down on her shoulders. She wasn't sure what she would face next, but she knew one thing. She had to face it. The woman's dark eyes glinted with something like approval. For a moment, Sasha thought she saw a flicker of emotion in her gaze. Something almost human. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only that same cold emptiness behind. "Very well," the woman said, stepping aside, as though making room for Sasha to step forward into the heart of the truth. "You have chosen." The ground beneath Sasha's feet shifted. The room itself seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as though the hut had come alive with its own history. The shadows in the corners stretched impossibly long, reaching out like fingers, clawing at the walls. Sasha's pulse quickened as she stepped further into the darkness, her feet dragging through the cold floor. The woman watched her, unmoving, her presence a silent weight. The dog, too, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, its eyes wide and alert as it stayed close by Sasha's side. As Sasha stepped deeper into the shadows, she reached out, her hand brushing against the walls of the hut. The wood felt ancient, worn smooth by time. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the sorrow, the terror, and the memories of those who had passed through before her. She could feel the pulse of something alive within them, something that thrived in the dark. And then, as though the hut itself were opening its secrets, a low creak echoed from the far corner, where the man's voice had once called out. The shadows there seemed to shift again, revealing a hidden door, a door that Sasha had not noticed before. It was old, worn, and half buried under layers of dust, but it was there. A hidden passage, a place she could not have seen unless she had chosen to look. Her heart raced as she reached for the door, her hand trembling with anticipation and fear. The woman didn't stop her. She only watched, her dark eyes unblinking. Sasha hesitated for only a moment before she stepped through, into the unknown, into whatever darkness awaited her on the other side. The door creaked open slowly, and Sasha found herself descending into the deep, oppressive darkness of the hut's secrets. The dog followed her, its paw steps silent against the cold stone, as they ventured deeper into the heart of this cursed place. The air grew colder still, the shadows growing longer, more tangible. She had made her choice. Now there was no turning back.